Hamilton municipal cemeteries are like museums, with their headstones serving as a record of our culture and social history. Through an enduring stone, they reflect personal and national sentiment, speak of love, pity, and patriotism, summarize lives of remarkable longevity, and remind us of lives lost through tragedy. Many of Hamilton's colorful characters and history lie buried in our cemeteries. The cemetery tour, The Stories in the Stones, tells their fascinating stories through free guided walking tours at Hamilton Cemetery. The Hamilton Cemetery is Canada's first and oldest municipally owned and operated cemetery, providing a lasting memorial, permanent tribute, and a final resting place to many loved ones. Hamilton Cemetery houses some notable burials. Early settlers such as Robert Land and George Hamilton, victims of the Desjardins railway disaster, and a large number of past mayors of Hamilton rest here. Former senators and American Civil War veterans of the War of 1812 can also be found buried in this historical cemetery. Robin McKee, local historian, will be our tour guide on this virtual Stories in the Stones tour.
This is the Hamilton Cemetery, and it's on Burlington Heights. It started in the 1850s, but it wasn't the Hamilton Cemetery at the time. It was called Burlington Cemetery, which was a little confusing because it was on Burlington Heights and not in Burlington. There were two other cemeteries here at the time. There was the Church of Ascension Cemetery and there was Christ Church Cathedral Cemetery. In the 1890s, the three cemeteries amalgamated and became the Hamilton Cemetery. We're standing in front of the stone of George Hamilton, the founder of the city of Hamilton. Now, it begins our Stories in the Stones with a history mystery. What we have here is that George Hamilton on his stone dies in 1836. I already told you that the cemetery's history did not start until 1850. How the heck did he get here when it wasn't a cemetery? I'll let you know. Anyway, what happens is that he's here now. He's in a prominent position right at the gatehouse in the office of the cemetery and at the main entrance to the cemetery. It's a prominent position, and the city put him here purposely for honoring the founder of our city. George Hamilton actually was from Niagara. During the War of 1812, he was a captain in the Niagara Dragoons, and he fought in nearly every battle of the War of 1812. He brought his family to the Burlington Heights, which was a fort by the British during the War of 1812, for safety. He went off to fight. While he was here, he met a man named James Duran. James Duran sold his 247 acres and the only stone house in the area to George Hamilton, and that gave George the idea to start a village. He petitioned the government for a new gore on his property. He gave back 2 acres of land to the government at the time, and they said yes. What's a new gore? A gore is where you have the courthouse, the registry office, and the jail. It came to Hamilton, and we never looked back. He had a map, he put all the streets on, and he named some of the streets of his family members. He had another problem though, and the problem was his land did not go to the bay, which was the highway of the times. It only went to King Street, which creates another weird thing of Hamilton, is that our downtown square is a triangle. And what happened there was that the man who owned the property from the King's Highway to the lake was Houston. And Houston said, I don't want to give 50% of my property away. George gave 50% property for the square that should have been in downtown Hamilton. And Houston reneged, and we have a downtown square that's a triangle. We have 2 King Streets, King Street North, King Street South, and it ends on James Street and goes all the way over past John. The other history mystery is, how did he get here? George Hamilton had his own family cemetery, and it was up against the escarpment down by where his home was. In the 1950s, the city was expanding to Jollicut, and they needed the space where the Hamilton family cemetery was. They removed the bodies and brought the family here. That's why George, who died in 1836, is now in the Hamilton Cemetery in the prominent position that he is, honoring him for the founding of our great city. We're standing in front of the Robert Land family vault. It is an iconic monument in the Hamilton Cemetery. It is a classic Gothic miniature church. It has its Gothic arch over the doorway, and it also has the abutments on the side, making it look like a church, and it also has the indents where the stained glass windows should be. It's a marvelous piece of architecture as a monument in the Hamilton Cemetery. Now, who was Robert Land? Robert Land was a sheriff in Pennsylvania during the rebellion in 1776, the United States. What happened was that he stayed loyal to the British. And you can see that on the monument, there is a plaque of the United Empire Loyalist. He was taking dispatches from Pennsylvania up to Niagara, to the fort on the American side today, Fort Niagara. And his neighbors did not like that. So they arrested him because they were revolutionaries, and Robert was being loyal to the British. And they put him in jail. There was a jailbreak, a shootout, he was wounded, and he disappeared into the forest. The Americans went back to their commanding officer and said, "We killed him." They went to Phoebe, his wife, and said, "Your husband is dead, and you're banished to Nova Scotia." In Nova Scotia, Phoebe runs into a man, and that man says, "Are you any relation to the Robert Land that is taking provisions out of Fort Niagara?" And at that moment, Phoebe had a leap of faith, and that leap of faith was her dead husband was alive. She got into a canoe and canoed back to Niagara. They pointed her in the direction of the head of the lake, which is what Hamilton was before Hamilton was a city. And she came up an inlet called Land's Inlet and met her dead, long dead husband of 9 years of separation. She is the hero of the family, because if she did not have that leap of faith in 1790 in Nova Scotia, one of her descendants went to Detroit, married a dentist, had a baby, and that baby flew the first solo flight across the Atlantic, Charles Lindbergh. William Weiner Cook is Hamilton's most famous Civil War veteran. That's not what he's famous for. During the American Civil War, he was a Canadian living in Mount Pleasant near Brantford, and he signed up to go across the border and fight with the Americans against the rebels of the South. During the American Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865, he met a man named General George Custer. That's what he's famous for. He met the man, became extremely good friends, and after the American Civil War was over, he reassigned himself to the 7th Cavalry with Custer, and they went out to Montana to put down the Sioux Uprising. Now this is where they all get famous, because they die at the Little Bighorn, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, on the Last Stand Hill. So we have a Hamiltonian, most famous Civil War veteran in Hamilton Cemetery, but he died in Montana with George Custer in 1876.